Topic 47B, the Cold War in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, 1945 to 1990. You should take notes during this podcast, pause it as necessary, and listen to it as many times as you need to, as you'll need them to complete future graded assignments. I recommend that you take notes in the Cornell method of note-taking as presented in Podcast 3 of this course. By the end of this podcast, you should be able to understand how the end of World War II led to decolonialization in Asia and Africa, explain how the Cold War influenced these regions, as well as Latin America and the Middle East, and identify American foreign policy goals in these four areas between 1945 and 1990. During the previous podcast, we learned that the Cold War was an ideological battle fought between the U.S. and its allies to maintain and spread democracy and capitalism, and on the other side, the USSR and its allies to maintain and spread communism and socialism. In Podcast 47A, we also learned about the manifestation of this ideological battle on the continent of Europe. The Cold War was a global one, however, fought not just on Europe, but throughout Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. In this podcast, we will discuss some of the more famous flare-ups in this ideological battle. But first, we need to consider why the US and USSR were able to wage this battle for so long in every part of the globe. For centuries, much, if not all, of the continents of Asia, Africa, Latin America had been dominated by a few of the nations of Europe. India, for example, had been a British colony. Cuba had been part of the Spanish Empire. Angola, dominated by Portugal. And Indochina, a colony of the French. Spain, one of the first to acquire overseas colonies in the late 15th century, had lost Cuba, Puerto Rico, and then the Philippines to the United States during the Spanish-American War in 1898. World War I, from 1914 to 18, stemmed largely from competition among European powers for colonies overseas, but began to weaken European dominance in global affairs. By the end of the Second World War, Europe lay in tatters, and its colonies took advantage of their weakness to strike for independence. India broke free from Great Britain, for example, in 1947, while Indochina began its first war against the French in 1946. Collectively, the global movement for independence from European colonialism that took place in the 3 decades after the end of World War II is known as decolonialization. While independence movements represented oppressed people's desire to govern themselves, it also often left the former colonies without a secure source of revenue with which to operate their newly independent nations. And so the US and USSR stepped into this opening in newly independent and weaker nations around the globe. In return for the nation's allegiance to and cooperation with the needs of the United States, countries like South Africa, South Korea, Guatemala, and Iran received financial aid from the Americans. In return for helping out the USSR in its ideological battle against the capitalism and the West, nations like Cuba, Angola, and North Vietnam accepted Soviet aid. Sometimes, post-war political needs determined weaker nations' allegiance. For example, following the Japanese annexation of Korea during the Second World War, the Korean Peninsula was divided at the 38th parallel by the United Nations. The UN designated the Soviet Union as the trustee of the northern half of the peninsula, and the US the trustee of the southern half. By 1948, the two sides formed two separate nations, North and South Korea. In 1950, backed by Soviet tanks and munitions, North Korea invaded its southern neighbor, precipitating the Korean War, a conflict in which more than 30,000 Americans and hundreds of thousands of others died. By the end of the conflict in 1953, the border remained unchanged, and despite the fact that the Soviet Union itself crumbled in 1991, North Korea remains ruled by a communist dictatorship as of 2016, when this podcast was created, one of the last vestiges of the Cold War. Occasionally, the U.S. intervened in the internal politics of weaker countries in order to secure a government aligned with American interests. Once so secured, this country would become the beneficiary of American aid. Take, for example, the cases of both Guatemala and Iran in 1954. In the former, the commercial interests of the United Fruit Company aligned with the interests of the anti-communist Eisenhower administration. Backed by the CIA, a force of 480 men invaded Guatemala and overthrew a democratically elected government in that country and installed one favorable to U.S. interests. For the next 35 years, Guatemala suffered at the hand of right-wing dictators that suppressed human rights but supported the anti-communist goals of the U.S. In 1953, convinced that communists supported a democratically elected prime minister in Iran, and worried about that country's recent nationalization of its oil fields, the CIA also orchestrated a coup in that country. The U.S. then helped to keep the Shah Reza Pahlavi in power until Islamic fundamentalists in that country overthrew the Shah in 1979. The cost of the Cold War in terms of blood, treasure, and sympathies lost are incalculable. The United States paid enormously during the Cold War in terms of lives lost on the battlefield during these proxy wars. Moreover, American citizens back home paid for the Cold War conflicts through higher taxes, added debt, or both. Resources diverted to the Defense Department could not be spent on improving education, infrastructure, or the lives of America's poor. Finally, millions of global citizens in Iran, Guatemala, Cuba, Vietnam, and elsewhere learned to resent American as well as Soviet intervention in their domestic affairs. The effects of this anti-Americanism began to rear its head in 1979, but continued to be felt to this day. Remember the learning objectives for this podcast. Write out each one in a sentence or a paragraph now. If you find that you cannot do so, go back to the beginning of the podcast, listen and watch again, and pause it as necessary to supplement the notes you've already taken until you can answer all of the learning objectives. Good luck.